Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the July 6th, 2017 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. I'd like to ask everyone to silence electronic devices right now. So cell phones, laptops, you can use them, just make sure they're on silent. Heather, would you please call the roll?
Ellie Tyson.
Here.
Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Phyllis McKee.
Here.
Iris Wadi Gibson.
Here.
Lisa Anderson and Mike Estes have been excused.
Thank you. Okay, so before we get into the bulk of the meeting, we do have two sets of minutes that need to be approved. Heather distributed those, May 4th and May 18th minutes, and I've reviewed them. I'm assuming everybody's reviewed them, so if everybody's okay with the minutes, we'll just do a head-nod approval unless there's comment. All right, so both sets of minutes are approved. So we have one item on the agenda tonight for the meeting, but before we start that, we have a public comment period. And this public comment period is for anyone who'd like to talk about something that's not on the agenda tonight. So our agenda item tonight is a proposed code amendment to allow, well, I'm not even going to get into details because it's kind of complicated, but it has to do with code amendments related to residential single and residential multifamily zoning. If you want to comment on anything else in the world, now's your chance. If you want to comment on that topic, wait and we'll have another opportunity during the public hearing. But now's a chance to talk about anything else. So if anyone would like to come on down and share their thoughts, feel free. Anybody? Okay. With that, we will close the public comment period. Thank you. So one item, it's a proposed code amendment, and I think because it's relatively complex to explain, I'm going to let Kathy explain it to us, if that's okay, and we'll just move right into the kind of the staff presentation. And then before we there's one person who did sign up to speak. Before we discuss as a body, we'll have the public comment after staff's presentation. Thanks, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. Kathy Bell, Senior Planner with the Planning Community Development Department. The request this evening is really more about timing. That's the primary request we have. And it's not really as much about substance. So a lot of times this body and city council see codes that we're trying to change substance. This is really more about timing. And as you'll see on the map that is presented above, there are actually 11 areas that are outlined in bold, and those are zoning sub-areas within different neighborhoods. And the thing that is unique about all of those is that they have been annexed into the city of Bellingham more recently than not. And as a part of that, when they were in Whatcom County, they had a zoning designation that we call URMX. And effectively, what that allowed is predominantly single family, but it allowed a mix of multifamily. And when we annexed those properties into the city, we put a provision in there to ensure that they would be retained as mostly residential developments, that they could only do their multifamily after a certain percentage of the single family was done. Well, what we're finding is that there are certain areas, those which are primarily bolded, that have something unique to them, unlike other sub-areas that were URMX'd when they were annexed. And what's unique about these sub-areas is they abut the majority of their boundaries abut a zoning other than residential single. So they either abut residential multi, commercial, or industrial. And what we've done is an analysis to determine that if we allow a portion or the multifamily to go first, it could actually provide a transition between the allowed single family and those other uses, primarily commercial and industrial. And when abutting residential multiple, they're like uses. So the code provisions or amendments that are within the ordinance attached in the packet present that very issue. This was initiated by a specific request by the RJ Group, and it was primarily for Area 20 of the Cordata neighborhood, which was one of the most recently annexed areas. And when we started to analyze this is when it grew to be more citywide. The only area that is not a part of the timing component is Area 13 of the Whatcom Falls neighborhood, which is in the southern part of the city. And the reason is that area abuts only residential single. So you may ask, why is it included? It's included because we added some additional clarification to the zoning that is already found in other parts of the Bellingham Municipal Code, that we're just trying to make our land use provisions legible, usable to the common public, to the professionals, and quite honestly, to staff at times. So those are some of that area has been amended to include some of the minor amendments that we also are proposing to the other 10 sub-areas to the north. The actual recommendation gives the director the authority to determine whether or not the multifamily should or could be developed prior to the single family. And we have a specific proposal right now by the RJ Group in Area 20, where we presented to the hearing examiner last month a proposal for approximately 440 units, and it included a mix of infill toolkit uses and multifamily uses. And the multifamily tract is directly behind the new Costco building. And we were not able at that time to present to the hearing examiner the timing of that, because this process that is before you this evening is moving somewhat together. And we're hopeful that with your recommendation to the City Council to support their recommendation, as well as the City Council's approval, that not only will they be able to begin with their single-family development, but they'll also begin with their multifamily development, which will provide that transition or buffer to the less intense single-family as they move north in their development. And it also gives the same opportunity for those other sub-areas that are so identified or bolded on the map above. As I stated before, the text amendments, there are minor text amendments presented that clarify mostly infill housing units, because infill housing units are permitted in these areas, and we put those into the language as well, so it's not to be confused that infill housing, because it is outright permitted by the infill housing chapter, that those housing types are considered single family for the purposes of these zoning sub areas and are not multifamily or duplexes. So those are some clarifications we've made. It's complex, but it's simple, and I think what I want to leave you with is this is really about timing. It's about when the multifamily development should occur. It's not saying that it can't occur anywhere else on site. If it does, it's not subject to the director giving the timing of that happening first. It's really only when it is abutting a non-residential zone does the director have the authority to allow it to go first or concurrent with. That's not saying it's required, but at the applicant's request, it's really about timing. That's the question that is before the Planning Commission this evening. So attached to the staff report, starting on page 8 is attachment 3, and starting on page 12 is attachment 4. And those are the draft Planning Commission findings of fact, conclusion, and recommendations in our draft ordinance. And staff asks that as you go through the proceedings this evening, that if there are any modifications necessary that you identify that are necessary to support the recommendation, that we discuss those and include those in the proceedings this evening. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Kathy. Before we get into a discussion, I think we should, since there's only one speaker, we should let them come up and speak. Of course, anybody else can speak too. So what we'll do is, this is a public hearing, so we'll have a public testimony opportunity. Anyone who wants to speak can speak on this topic. We'll give you a period of time to come to the mic. You need to state your name and address, and then you can speak to the topic. And Carrie Veldman is the only person who signed up, so she's going to go first. And it doesn't mean that you can't speak. If something strikes you, you want to talk about this topic, you can come up after Carrie and share your thoughts.
My name is Carrie Veldman. I'm with the RJ Group, and we support staff's recommendation to allow the text amendment as proposed. It's an accepted and effective planning practice to provide a transition from more of an intensive land use to a less intensive land use. Typically, this would include establishing a transitional use or such as multifamily housing, which allows for a graduated reduction in development intensity and scale. Practice has indicated that the early establishment of a transitional use reduces a significant disincentive associated with the development of the less intensive use. In many cases, the less intensive use, such as single-family housing, residences adjacent to the commercial or industrial uses would not develop with that, without the presence of that transition or buffer zone. In the case of our subject property in Area 20 of the Cordata neighborhood, just north of Costco, it's a significant disincentive to have single-family directly adjacent to the commercial use due to noise, traffic, excessive night lighting, and aesthetic deterioration generated from that activity. The proposed text amendment would allow an adequate transition zone, such as multifamily housing, to be established before or concurrently to single-family housing is constructed. We believe this code amendment is in the public interest, as it establishes a desired intensity of development and creates a development pattern that blends seamlessly between two varying land uses and provides for a safe and active neighborhood to develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Is there anyone else who would like to speak who didn't sign up? Now's your chance. Okay, seeing no one, we will close the public testimony portion of the hearing, and I think we'll just open it up to, thanks, Garrett, questions or discussion amongst the commission or questions for Kathy. Does anybody have anything? Yeah. Take us away.
I had quite a few questions, but I'll try to narrow as much as possible here. One question I had, and I'm not sure, both of you spoke to this, so if both of you wanted to speak to it again, that I'd welcome that. But both of you shared that single-family development might not occur in the neighborhood without that transitional buffer because of some of the negative impacts of being so close to a commercial buffer. And I'm curious what sort of the differences would be and why it would be better for someone living in a multifamily unit, like a duplex or an apartment, would they experience those issues less?
I don't think they're experiencing issues less. I think what you find in many different zoning types or forms of zoning are the transition of uses, and you usually go in the center of your most intense and you go out to the least intense. And the idea is that the multifamily is more intense than the single family, but it's less intense than the commercial. So everything is buffering each other. And then as you move out into the county, you are even less intense because now you're rural development. So it's not that one is there for the other, but they're kind of there for themselves as well. So there's really no right or wrong. One of the things that I would point out is what we've identified numerous times is when we have approved developments that allow a mix of single family and multifamily, and the single family goes first and the multifamily goes last. Often we find that when that multifamily moves into an established single family neighborhood, even though it's part of the overall plan, it is not received well because they are now moving in, those impacts are now moving in to a single family neighborhood. And what this does is it gives us that opportunity to not only provide that transition, but it also provides the opportunity to establish a neighborhood and a different character. So it is not just a single-family neighborhood, it is a mixed residential neighborhood, which is how we all should start to view our neighborhoods in the city of Bellingham as we accept more infill.
Wonderful, thank you. Someone else wants to.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else have Phyllis?
Well, I was just going to
Thanks,
say, there really isn't anything other than the sequence in which we're putting something together. It wouldn't change the proportions or anything other than that. You're just talking about sequence, is what I gleaned from this.
Exactly. It's
Yeah,
all about
okay.
timing, sequence, however you want to phrase that. That's exactly what it is. So it either can go first
Right.
and concurrent with single family, or it can go after the percentage of single-family is done. That's exactly to the
Or
point.
at the same time?
It's about timing, exactly.
I wanted to confirm that too, that we're not actually adding additional multifamily density. It would still be capped at those percentages
Yes.
that
Yep.
exist today. Eric, do you have, Steve, sorry?
Yeah, it's my understanding that Area 20 is not part of the Cordata PUD, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah?
This makes sense to me. I just wonder, why are we leaving it as a director's decision? I mean, if it's qualified by being abutting or across from non-residential, single-family use, why can't that just be an outright permitted use?
And we talked about that, and primarily it goes back to what I mentioned without this much clarity, is that URMX is primary single family. So we still want some assurances that the majority of the neighborhood is going to be single family. And as we find markets, they define what developers choose and want to build. And the question is, should we only allow a multifamily development to come in without understanding the rest of the development and how the single family can be developed? So it gives planning staff the discretion with an application to determine, is this all we're ever going to get as multifamily? And should that happen? Or is there an overall plan and concept of how the single family, how it's going to fully develop into what the intent of the zoning is?
So by having that provision in there, then you, applicant or a property owner would have to have a more complete master plan of the entire site to apply for this waiver.
That is how we are anticipating most of the sites, but in some context, maybe not. But it gives us the flexibility to look at each site specifically and just to see, you know, what is around it and, you know, what can the impacts be. Multifamily to multifamily may not be as significant because those are like uses.
What about the impacts? Because that seems pretty vague. If it's been discussed to be an appropriate sequencing or timing of building and buffering of uses, what's the criteria? Is the criteria clearly defined for the director to make the decision of whether or not it's appropriate or not?
There is no, we didn't want to establish any criteria with this, and really it will be a request that comes in with a land use application to basically a request that the multifamily come in prior to and or concurrent with single family. And to your point earlier, we're anticipating that the good majority of proposals will include a single family and a multifamily. There aren't many parcels out there under this scenario that are as large of holdings as the 70 acres we just considered. And so we may not see other proposals with 110 multifamily units as proposed specifically under the RJ group. So if we're looking at a fourplex or we're looking at an eightplex or we're looking at something like that, that may not be as significant in terms of wondering what the rest of the land is going to do. But in this specific context, we really needed to know what the development was going to happen. And this will allow them, as they go through their phase development, to do multifamily when they feel it's appropriate to do that and not wait until they have 170 single-family units before they can do their multifamily.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think based on this, it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes more sense to have some of the multifamily built out before you have single family because people know what they're buying when they're buying single family. I mean, that's a good point. My concern, I guess, would be is, should that just be an outright use? There's just some ambiguity there, and with a larger project, you could have quite a bit of resources invested into applying for this waiver without any kind of clear criteria of whether you're meeting the intent or not. Physically, you're meeting the intent, but in the spirit, it seems kind of ambiguous.
I think through all of our pre-application conferences that we have with staff and the actual application process, I don't think that there are many times, if ever, where a decision from the pre-app is radically changed to the application if all things are held constant. meaning all the information.
Before the major investment.
It's definitely something that would be discussed early on, and, you know, to be able to go through that part of the process. So we didn't want to complicate the process with criteria, because the criteria is you're not abutting
Right.
single family.
Right.
So that is the criteria that allows you to do this. The discretion just gives staff the discretion to review, to ensure that it's going to make sense.
Well, thanks, Kathy.
Anybody? Iris, you have another question? I kind of agree with you, Kathy, a little bit on that, because I think that the criteria are that they're in here kind of. It's abutting or across the street right away, and it's intended for a transition. And so in my mind, if you came in and you were abutting across the street and you were proposing it as a transition, and the city would have to deny that request in a permit, right? And then that could be appealed. And then the person reviewing the appeal would be going, well, the code says if it's abutting or across and it's intended for transition, you should do it. City, why didn't you do it? And the staff would have to have, I would imagine the city would have to have a pretty strong reasoning. And I know that's way down the road and talking appeals and stuff, but I kind of like the idea of not making it too formal. Just, I don't know. For me, if it was only little things, I think no big deal. But I actually think it's more important to have the city have the opportunity to make that judgment when you're talking about a really big project, like 100. I don't know how many there are out there that are that big. If it was just a fourplex, I don't think I'd care that much if it was just explicit, but 50, 100 units, that's a pretty big deal. But I also agree that in general, it makes sense for a number of reasons to me. Does anybody have any other questions? I had one other one, but if you want to, okay. You mentioned that in this context, an infill housing project would be considered single family. So in theory, you could do your entire project as an infill housing project,
Yes.
infill toolkit housing
Yes.
project.
And I want to slightly clarify that. It is not considered single family. It is put into the same category as single family in determining that it's not duplex and apartments.
Yeah. So that's getting at my question, which is that in my understanding, an infill toolkit project is allowed, or I mean, is multifamily from like an impact fee standpoint and from a design review standpoint and that kind of stuff. And so that would still be the case here, or are we kind of like saying in these areas, infill toolkit isn't multifamily, it's single family, but over here, if you do it, it's multifamily.
What we're saying is the infill housing chapter 2028 of the Bellingham Municipal Code specifically states that annexations after 1995 with residential
them.
single mixed allows the use of the infill housing chapter. That's all we're saying.
Gotcha. But you're also saying that it can be the 100% of the project.
Yes.
Which means it's not multifamily.
Correct.
In this particular context.
That's right.
Gotcha. Okay. But it would still be subject to, if I came in with a 400 lot infill toolkit project, it would still be subject to design review and all those typical multifamily standards.
It would be no different no matter where you
Anywhere
were in
you
the
did
city
it.
of
Okay.
Bellingham.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I
Yes.
understood that because
Yes.
that's slightly different.
Right. So the clarifications or the minor amendments is just trying to be very specific that infill housing is allowed.
Yeah, and I think that's great.
Because it kind of comes in and out, and it depends on which version and unfortunately which planner did the annexation and did the comparable zoning.
Yeah.
And you can see that each one is slightly different, and the most recent annexation we did was even slightly different than all of the above. So we try to make it better every time, but every time we try to make it better, we don't go back to fix what isn't better. And so this is our opportunity to fix everything at once and to make it consistent.
I appreciate that, and I think that it's good that you've chosen to categorize an infill project in that context because I think it'll encourage people to do them. If it was considered multifamily, you could only do 25% of your project as an infill project, and you might go, it's not worth it for 25%. But this provides the flexibility for a developer to say, you know what, I want to do the whole thing in cottages, or I want to do the whole thing in townhouses, or whatever it might be. And so I like that because it'll encourage those alternative housing forms, maybe.
And I think the other opportunity exists is that our northern area of the city is the inundated with most critical areas of any portion of the city. And so the infill housing also allows a lot more flexibility and helps achieve densities. So
That's a good
there's
point.
there's a lot of benefits.
Anybody else?
Well, just, so with the special regulations, the duplex and multifamily, so in the infill housing forms, duplex, triplex, those are still going to be treated as multifamily.
No, if you do infill housing, so you could, ironically, why anybody would do this, but just to clarify that point, you could do a duplex under infill and you could do a duplex under multifamily regulations, and they're completely different.
With this limit of 25%, could you have 100% of your project be duplexes?
If it was infill housing, duplex. Because the rules and regulations are different of how the multifamily under 2032 versus 2028. They're completely different set of regulations. And what we're actually finding is a lot of people aren't using the duplex under the infill housing chapter, and they're choosing to use the duplex regulations under the multifamily chapter.
Because it's a little more straightforward?
More opportunity for floor area. It's not as restrictive.
Right.
The 1,000-foot
Yeah,
max.
the floor
Yeah.
area ratio, you could
Right.
do bigger units.
So we don't envision that happening, but that would be because infill housing is specific to a certain chapter in the Bellingham Municipal Code, just as duplex and apartments are a specific chapter in the Bellingham Municipal Code. So for us, there's a bright line between the two.
I see, okay. Thanks.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to say, I think it's a very creative way of doing something. I like that. Looks good.
Iris, yeah.
When I was out looking at the area, I noticed too, something that I really liked about it was that it seems like the places where these are situated really create an opportunity that even though you're increasing the density of an area and putting some multifamily and potentially more of a condensed space, that they're all really close to public transit and to good arterials. So it seems like it mitigates the infill really nicely.
Thank you. That's our objective.
If there's no other comment, we should have a motion.
I'll move to approve the text amendment as proposed in the July 6th staff report.
Second?
Okay, so there's a motion and a second. The motion was to move to recommend approval of the text amendment as described in the July 6th staff report, and forward our findings, of fact, conclusions to council. Is there any further discussion? We I think, talked through some of the questions, but if there's more, this is an opportunity. All right, so seeing none, I think we should call the vote. So all those in favor of Garrett's motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, so that carries 5-0. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for explaining it clearly. So with that, we are done with our public hearing. We've just got a couple minor things to talk about, and then we will get everybody out of here. There's no old or new business on the agenda. I know Greg's out of here and Kurt's out of here, and so I'm not going to ask you to try and predict what's actually going on with our agenda. But I do have scheduled here that we have a public hearing on August 3rd for the Whatcom Community College Institutional Master Plan, which should be pretty interesting. Do you know who's doing that, Kathy?
Yeah, Kim will be presenting that, and most likely myself and Chris Cook will be there to
Great.
assist her.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yeah.
Oh, I didn't have a question so much. I just wanted to
Oh,
say,
yeah.
for the good of the order, that it seems like the next 3 meetings are going to be really important, and so I wanted to encourage the public to come out to talk about short-term rentals and ADUs, and things that have been really burbling up in our community, in a good time and space to talk about them. So I hope folks will come out.
Hopefully it'll be raining in like 55. We'll get more people here then, I think. But I agree. I think it's really important. And you know what? We have better meetings when we get robust public comment, frankly. That informs us. So I second that. And with that, thanks again, Kathy, and we will adjourn.